Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and wanted to sit and talk to you for a while. I don't know, I have been thinking a lot this past week especially about a certain type of book that is no longer recommended in witchcraft and particularly Wicca and Witchcraft because that's the kind of witchcraft I'm most involved in. And I think it's kind of a shame that it's no longer recommended. So I don't know, I wanted to talk about reading primary sources in witchcraft. It is no secret that for much of the history of Wicca, Wiccans had a bad understanding of history, of the history of witchcraft, of the history of paganism, of the origins of Wicca, of the relationship between Wicca and ancient paganism, and so on, right? Wiccans, as a general rule, believed a lot of things that are simply not historically correct, right? Believed that the people persecuted in the early modern witch trials were practicing the same neo-pagan witchcraft that we practice today, believed that Wicca was ancient and was sort of a global cult of the mother goddess. These are common things that even still today sometimes people will spout, and we know better now. We have access to better historical information, and we know that that's not true, right? Wicca is a religion that goes back to 1939, roughly, is sort of the way that most people date it. Gerald Gardner was probably initiated into something by people who, prior to him, had made it all up, and Gardner probably sincerely believed that what he was initiated into was ancient. But Wicca, as it looks today, goes back no further than the early to mid 20th century. But throughout the 20th century history of Wicca, there were books that were commonly recommended that people relied on to support what we now know to be this flawed picture of Wiccan history. Right, so books like Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe, or to a lesser extent, Aradia, The Gospel of the Witches. These are books that people would pull out as evidence that Wicca had this history they believed it to have. And I think the thing that I'm thinking about lately, wrestling with, is, now that we have a better understanding of history, people don't really read or recommend those books anymore. For obvious reasons, right? Like if I'm introducing someone to Wicca, I'm not going to start them off with a book from 150 years ago that was A, just very dense and difficult to read, but B, presents information that is not historically accurate and that has been supplanted in recent decades by much better information, right? I'm going to introduce someone to Wicca with, a practical how-to book, and if they want to know about the history, I'm going to recommend Ronald Hutton or, grudgingly, Philip Heselton. I'm not going to recommend The Witch Cult in Western Europe to someone who wants to understand the history of Wicca, because I know that that's not what the history of Wicca actually is, right? It turns out that Margaret Murray's hypothesis about this pan-European witch cult that survived into early modern Europe is just a load of crap. But the reason I am making this video is that I still think those books are actually really worth reading, so long as we approach them as primary sources. Right, so I won't spend too much time defining this distinction because I don't want to talk down to you, but primary versus secondary sources is a distinction that you get in a lot of academia. The rough idea being that a secondary source is a book about history written after the fact that is put together by a modern historian who's compiling information and providing us with an analysis of it. Whereas a primary source is a book or a source, or it doesn't have to be a book, a leaflet that was written at the time, and that gives you a first-hand account of events, but one that is necessarily colored by the worldview of someone living through those events, and therefore might be unreliable in certain ways, and might require a close critical analysis to sort of read through the biases of someone living at the time. So I think that books like, I've taken Margaret Murray as my chief example, but I'll talk through a couple of others. Books like The Witch Cult in Western Europe are really important primary sources in the history of Wicca, because they not only did they contribute to people's understanding of their own historiography, their own narrative about their history. You read through The Witch Cult in Western Europe. I reread The Witch Cult in Western Europe recently, and my copy of it is somewhere on these shelves, but I don't actually know where it is. I can't find it. It also might be upstairs in the living room. I will have to look around. I'll find it eventually. But, I reread The Witch Cult in Western Europe recently. And hot damn, that thing is a primer on the Gardnerian tradition. There are a lot of things in there that we don't do. There are a lot of things we do that aren't in there. But reading through that book, with the contextual understanding of sort of what Wicca turned into, it's really obvious how influential that book was, and how much the ideas about witchcraft and paganism presented in that book made their way into the collective consciousness of early Wiccans and shaped the creation of the Gardnerian tradition, or other Wiccan traditions for that matter. And I think that going through and reading a text like that with that kind of close critical eye, and trying to read it not for, truth about historical witchcraft, historical in this sense meaning early modern, but rather reading it as a primary source and reading it to understand how this author's ideas shaped what we do today, is an incredibly valuable exercise. Another really big one that I wax poetic about all the time, and people do not share my opinions about this, so I won't be offended if you disagree with me. But I think The Golden Bough is a really important book for Wiccan Street. I have the Oxford World Classics edition right up there, that big white one, which is heavily abridged, and honestly it's a really, really good edition. It's a really good critical sort of distilling of the Golden Bough. But, Sir James Frazer was flawed in a lot of ways, was super fucking racist. And his whole idea of sort of the widespread myth of the dying and resurrecting God as sort of a primitive precursor to Christianity, right? Not terribly well supported if you actually look at the diversity of world religions. And also part of this modernist practice that wanted to place the diversity of religions in a pseudo-evolutionary framework where there was a timeline starting with the primitive religion, evolving into civilization in this case basically meaning England, and Frazer's ultimate goal was to discredit Christianity and to move civilization out of Christianity and into atheism. So there are a lot of problems with that book. It's also amusingly racist in ways that we forget that people in 19th century England were. So it's racist in all of the usual ways, but then he also has passages where he'll just go off about, the primitive savages of Scotland. And you forget that people in 19th century England were racist about everyone. So that's a sidebar, but the point is, despite all of the problems with that book, it's a really good book to read if you're looking to understand where Wiccan ideas and practices came from. Sorry, my roommate's up in the kitchen, so you might hear some background noise. The myth of the dying and resurrecting God is a big deal in Wicca. The goddess as sort of eternal and present, and her consort the god as coming and going, dying and being reborn, and the connection between that and the seasons and agriculture, all of that comes straight out of James Frazer. And it's really central to Wiccan theology. Even the basic format of sympathetic magic that most Wiccans practice is a paradigm that was first theorized, first sort of conceptually defined by James Frazer. Right? People were doing sympathetic magic before Frazer, but in terms of our understanding of what we do when we do low magic, that theoretical framework comes from James Frazer. And I think it's valuable for us as witches to go back and read the primary sources and identify that for ourselves. So yeah, I mean, there are a handful of other sort of books that I feel similarly about, where I think they're worth reading as primary sources and with that kind of critical eye. They're not necessarily worth reading because they're right, but they're worth reading because they're important historical documents. One that I go back and forth on, because it's a hard read, and once again, also super racist. But I'll be damned if it wasn't influential, is Helena Blavatsky, and mostly The Secret Doctrine, but also Isis Unveiled. Blavatsky was so influential. So influential. And people forget how influential she was. But so much of modern occultism, both things that are decent and all of the like nasty, stupid, fluffy, new agey crap that we find in modern occult communities, so much of that comes from Blavatsky. She is the one who popularized the doctrine of reincarnation in Western Europe. She is the one who's largely responsible for Westerners having adopted the 7 chakra model as an appropriation of Hindu cosmology, because in Hindu texts there's inconsistency over how many chakras there are and where they're placed in the body, and there are multiple paradigms at work. And Helena Blavatsky is the one who came in and said, nope, 7, this is the one we're going to use, this is... Blavatsky loved the number 7, she had all kinds of stuff about it, a lot of which was very racist. There were 7 races in the world, and there was a hierarchy among them, and bad stuff. So, I'm not saying read these books uncritically, I'm not saying celebrate these authors, but there are important and influential ideas that we have in Wicca, in witchcraft, in occultism more generally, that come from Blavatsky. And people forget that. And I'm going to say something controversial, but I don't think I'm wrong. I think Helena Blavatsky was easily as influential as Aleister Crowley. And people forget Blavatsky's influence, in part because she was kooky, in part because a lot of the ideas that she popularized are now very much out of vogue, and in part, let's be honest, because she was a woman. And we've sort of erased her contribution to the greater occult scene. But she was so popular, she was so influential on the Golden Dawn and all of its descendants, right? Anytime you find a Golden Dawn author referring to something as established occult doctrine, 7 times out of 10, they read it in Blavatsky. And probably genuinely thought that it was ancient and established occult doctrine. But, like, where they got their ideas about what the occult tradition was, it's Blavatsky. So, the fourth book that I want to mention, I don't have a copy of it because I read it as a library copy, and I've never bothered to acquire my own. Robert Graves and the White Goddess. The triple goddess is very much out of vogue these days. People tend not to conceptualize the Wiccan goddess as a maiden mother crone paradigm. But that was extraordinarily influential. And you read through the White Goddess, and it's not just the triple goddess is the most famous idea from that book. Most of that book is devoted to his tree alphabet. Most of that book is not about the triple goddess. But the idea of the goddess and, once again, her consort, and in particular his translation of the Song of Amergin is A, just extraordinary. It's a beautiful piece of poetry. B, you find it all over fucking pagan places. C, I think it's strongly influenced the idea of sort of charges and poetry that we find in modern Wicca that is supposedly the voice of the gods. A lot of these things, they come out of Robert Graves. And Graves is a beautiful poetic author. There are historical inaccuracies in that book. That book is wrong, just flat out wrong about a lot of things. But it's still really worth reading. Not because I agree with his tree alphabet. I think the tree alphabet is silly. But because it or at least it has provided me, and I am now evangelizing to you, it has provided me with just an incredible amount of context and nuance in understanding where pieces of Wiccan theology and ritual and belief and practice come from. Where do these ideas come from, and how have they changed over time in order to get to us? Professionally, I work on the history of philosophy. So I study where ideas come from and how they change over time in order to get to us. That's what I do for a living. So it's maybe unsurprising that I think this kind of project is worthwhile in a religious context. But really and truly, read the books that are discredited, because before they were discredited, people took them seriously, and they had an incredible amount of impact on the witchcraft that we know today. And you can get a certain amount of this, right? If you read Ronald Hutton, is Hutton in frame here? I don't see him. I have The Triumph of the Moon on the shelf back there somewhere. But you can read Ronald Hutton, and you should read Ronald Hutton. And one of the things that Hutton is very good about is he'll say, we have these ideas that came from this text, we have these ideas that came from this text. He'll situate Wicca contextually, and he'll give you an understanding of what the literary and historical forces were at work that sort of converged to give rise to Wicca. And for that, The Triumph of the Moon is an unparalleled book. But I would argue it's still worth doing the reading on your own time, the research on your own time, to dive into those texts for yourself, read through them and see what they have to say, and then judge for yourself how those ideas have bled through into modern practice, because I guarantee you they have. There is not a Wiccan alive today whose practice is not at least touched by. I'm gonna go with those 5 books, right? So Aradia, The Gospel of the Witches, Margaret Murray and the Witch Cult in Western Europe, Helena Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, James Frazer and the Golden Bough, and Robert Graves and the White Goddess. Read those 5 books. And they're hard, and they're dense, and they're outdated, and in many cases, like I say, very, very racist. But they're really important primary sources, and I think they provide such a valuable insight into what it is that we do today. So, I will get off my soapbox now. I will stop rambling. This was fun. I inevitably, I only post YouTube videos after Thorn Mooney has recently uploaded a YouTube video, and I'm like, oh, Thorn posted something. I remember that YouTube exists now. Maybe I should do that. So, thank you, Thorn, for existing on the internet. Thorn is great. I've talked about her before. I'll, check her out. I'll link to her YouTube channel. But anyways, Samhain's coming up. Have a good Samhain, everyone. And you'll see me at some point soon. Bye.